Thank you, Dr. Milani, for the invitation, and Roma and Federico for all the hard work. I know I directed a center at my own university, and I know that on paper we are directors, but in reality, those people who actually do the work are those who sort of do all the logistics and conceptions and all the really, really hard work that at the end we all take the credit for. So thank you so much for all your work. The talk tonight might sound a little bit counterintuitive for many of you who were a part of the Iranian Revolution or are more familiar with the Iranian Revolution. And I want to highlight that this is mostly a conceptual talk, trying to make sense of this revolution, which remains a mystery for not only the mass media or for common people, but also among academics. It remains one of the most important mysteries of 20th century. I want to start, of course, this picture, somebody was asking me, this picture is from summer of 1978. This is very appropriately called Eisenhower Street in Tehran. Of course, no more, because, this is the first major protest rally in Iran during the revolution that happened in the summer of 1978. The talk I'm going to focus on has a lot to do with this sort of basic premise. I came of intellectual age as a very aspiring and young Marxist who wanted to change the world, as I'm sure many of you can relate to that kind of impulse that young people feel so much energy in their guts, and that energy appears to be limitless at times. So as Jean-Paul Sartre once said that, you know, if you were not a Marxist up to the age of 30, you missed a lot, and if you remain a Marxist after age 30, you're basically dumb, you know. But I clearly remember that that reading for the first time at the age of 16 or 17. This was our teenage rebellion, reading Marx, you know. And those days, some of you might remember, and those days there were these sort of clandestine texts of Marxist literature. Marxist literature was banned under the Shah. It was very, very hard to come by Marxist literature, or naming Marx was really hard. In most books of philosophy and history in Iran in the 1960s and 70s, whenever they wanted to refer to Marx, they said, the great thinker of 19th century, you know, and everybody knew that's Marx. So, but this little passage here appeared even at that young age a rather peculiar kind of assertion that the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. What is problematic about this statement? The problem is that Marx, particularly for Marx, the theorist of revolution, the theorist of historical agency, the theorist that came up with this idea that actually there are material foundation for this kind of revolutionary movement, that people rise up. For Marx, you know, proletariat rises up and changes the world. But if you think about this little sentence from the preface of the first edition of Das Kapital, if you lived in Iran, for example, at that time, or if you lived in most part of the world outside Europe at that time, your future was already determined. Right? The future, because the industrial world already showed the future of the non-European parts of the world. So in a sense, it rendered the entire world outside Europe without an agency. Of course, this is like very sort of important passage in Marx, because it also points to a very important tension in Marx's idea of, or philosophy of history, that philosophy of history that argues that, you know, history moves forward, and that movement forward is caused by the participation and mobilization of the masses, of the proletarian masses. So if there is an inherent logic into history, I mean, all these things I'm saying that I'm going to sort of connect it to the Iranian Revolution sooner rather than later. So the inherent tension in this is that if there is a sense of inevitability in history, if there are historical necessities that eventually would change societies, no matter what happened, these changes are inevitable. So if the changes are inevitable, why bother? Why people go and sacrifice their lives and do all these things, go through the pain of endless meetings and mobilizing people, going to factories, organizing labor, and doing all these things, while we know, if this is true, that there is an inherent logic into history, that history in a sense is very is going towards a already determined end, then why bother? Of course, I say this because this became actually one of the most important parts of the split in Marxist movement around the world. I mean, the very first split in Marxist ideology in communist movement was the split exactly around this point, that the Bolsheviks in Russia said that actually, you know, what Marx said is not that if you just sit at home and drink Kool-Aid, the world is going to change inevitably. You know, you have to actually assert yourself. Others say that, well, you know, because capitalism reaches a point at the end that it collapses on its own weight, as Marx predicted in his Capital. And then, you know, we just fight for a little sort of kinder and gentler capitalism until the moment that capitalism comes to an end. And those, we know who those people were. Those are the European social democracy. You know, Kautsky was the first person who sort of split from that sort of Marxist revolutionary ideology. And today we have, you know, social democrats in Europe, and and thank God suddenly we have a social democrat in the US, American politics, Bernie Sanders, you know. So, but this goes back really to this little passage in Marx's understanding of history, that kind of what we say in our business, because this is an important term I want you to remember, because I'm going to come back to this, a very teleological view of history. A teleological view of history. A teleological view of history meaning that history has a purpose. History unfolds on a very predetermined line, goes from one stage to another. Of course, you know, those of you who had a brush with Marxism would know that Marx would say, you know, from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. So that's what we call a teleological view of history. So what is the problem with this teleological view of history? And I want to make a case here that it's exactly the dominance of that kind of teleological view It's exactly that kind of teleological view that history moves from predetermined stages that made the Iranian Revolution very problematic. People could not figure this out. So what happened that suddenly we were all supposed to go towards a very predetermined direction, and suddenly there comes this revolution. By the way, the most popular revolution in world history. If you ask, some of you teach classes, if you ask anyone that name a revolution in world history, 90% of people would say French history. French history, French Revolution. French Revolution, only 2 to 2.5% of the population participated in French Revolution. Iranian Revolution, wild guess. 85%? Estimates between 10 to 15%. This is like, depending how you count. Of course, I mean, believe it or not, there are people whose job is to sit there and count these things. And they get paid for it too. I mean, that's a good job, you know. So, I mean, the numbers of like participants in the Iranian Revolution, let's say between 10 to 15%. Russian Revolution, 1.5% of Russians were involved in Russian Revolution. So you see that when I say that this amazing revolution is happening, totally unprecedented in world history, that many people actually march on the streets, directly involved in the revolution, which is actually not based on the predetermined plans of this kind of historical understanding. So you understand that why this is so sort of, in a sense, bizarre event. And many people are still today struggling. That's why I keep writing books about the Iranian Revolution, because there's so much to figure out in this revolution. So of course, what happened here? Okay. When we talk about the Iranian Revolution, there are two basic assumptions that goes back to this kind of trying to explain what happened in the Iranian Revolution. One basic assumption, very dominant, conventional reading of the Iranian Revolution, that, oh no, this was a revolution that was happening along those historical lines, and then the mullahs came and stole it. So sort of the hijacked revolution. So it's very, very dominant view. I would say easily like 90% of the literature on the Iranian Revolution is about that sort of narrative, that the Iranian Revolution was hijacked. It was truly based on those lines, but then hijacked by the mullahs. By the way, this is a photo, as I said, by Abbas, who just died a couple of weeks ago, one of the most important photographers that Iran ever produced. We're just starting, so. We're just starting the revolution, you know. You missed the part on Marx, but we're starting the revolution. So that's one narrative that I think that in my work I try to actually reject that hypothesis and argue that if there was a revolution in Iran, it was an Islamic revolution, and without the clergy, there couldn't be a revolution as massive as we saw happening in Iran. No other social, political force in Iran could manage to mobilize numbers of people, bring them to the streets the way the clergy could. And So in that sense, I think, I want to reject that idea that it was them, and some of my old friends are here today, and I think if there was any attempt to hijack the revolution, it was actually the other way around. As young Marxists and communists in Iran, we tried to hijack that revolution, and we failed. And of course, this is a very sort of curious kind of understanding of the Iranian Revolution, which doesn't really match a lot of other writings about other revolutions. There's a very famous expression among historians that people say that history is written by the victors. However, the winners always write the history. In the Iranian Revolution case, the story is actually the other way around. Most of the literature on the Iranian Revolution is written by the losers of the revolution. Most people in the Western world, there are a lot of narratives produced in Iran, but they don't get any traction. But most narratives, accepted narratives, conventional narratives of the Iranian Revolution is written by people who lost the power struggle after the revolution. So in this case, unlike other cases of histories of revolutions, the history is written by the losers rather than by the winners. The other purpose of what I'm doing here in this book and in some of my other work is to try to de-provincialize Iranian history. What does that mean to say, to de-provincializing Iranian history? At the conceptual level, whatever we understand about world history, all the points of reference about world history, the way we make sense of the world, make sense of a social world, all the points of reference are events that has happened in Europe. When we say revolution, the yardstick for revolution always is French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and now a little bit Chinese Revolution. I'll talk more about this later. But when I say that I want to de-provincialize Iranian history, I want to argue that there are things that happened in Iran that really worth contemplating at a very general philosophical level. Philosophical level in terms of contribution interventions in historiography, in terms of making sense of what history is. And that sort of sense that I said in the beginning, that there is a sense that history is unfolding going forward, and instead of understanding Iranian Revolution as just an aberration on this sort of progressive linear line, I want to bring Iranian history, Iranian Revolution, into our understanding of history and to make sense of it in that context. There are interesting debates in historiography that some people argue that history has a linear progressive line. There's another argument, mostly by mid-19th century, late 19th century Italian philosophers like Vico, who said that history is like a branching tree. The branching tree that it goes towards different directions, and there are forces that try to push this tree and turn this branching tree into a Sarve Shiraz, just going straight up, cut all these things. So I want to basically, when I say that I want to de-provincialize Iranian Revolution, I want to sort of release that tree and to say, okay, let's allow this tree to branch out and to see what possibilities are there in history, outside the possibilities that are given to us and has become second nature to us. Second nature in the sense that we understand them without questioning them. Like we say that, if you are losing your voice, you drink a sip of water. You don't question them. So that's what I mean by de-provincializing Iranian history, and then I want to make an argument that why Foucault is very important in that attempt to de-provincialize Iranian Revolution and bring it to the center of the way that we understand the world, the way we understand history. The way we understand history as a condition of possibilities rather than the unfolding of inevitable outcomes. Restoring agency, that's what I say. So that kind of understanding of history really was reflected in the historiography of Iranian Revolution in a very, very important way. That it created most of the literature after the revolution, in a sense, is a sort of a revisionist understanding of Iranian history that is constructed around a very, very important binary. This binary is that on the one side of it, again, you know this when I say these binaries, which we call these constitutive binaries. We say the constitutive binaries because they really shape and frame our understanding of history. That on one side there are progressive, secular, and democratic forces. On the other side there are religious, conservative, obstructionist forces in modern Iranian history. And it's in this struggle between these two forces that modern Iranian history has been shaped. So I want to argue against this kind of binary understanding, to say that in practice, if you delve into what happened in Iranian history, I have a couple of examples that I'm going to talk about tonight. If you delve into the Iranian history, you realize that these binaries, in general, binary understanding of the world, like black and white, good and evil, secular, religious, public, private, man, woman, all these binaries are really nice and neat and really make us feel really good. It gives us a very unambiguous sense of the world. But when you get into the world, you realize that the world is such a messy place that these binaries actually never play out the way they appear on the paper. There's a very important sociologist at Princeton University, Robert Wisnow, who had this really interesting exchange with one of his PhD students, and said that, what you write is very messy, and he said that, well, this is good, because the world is messy, society is messy, and there should be some room in your writing that reflects that messiness. Everything doesn't look as clean as these binaries in the real world. These binaries really don't have utility in the way that we understand the world. Of course, when I say this, then I'm just going to mention this because it is on my slide. I don't want to get it too complicated here. That there are two different sort of ways that we can understand the Iranian Revolution and the history of modern Iran. There's this kind of epistemological. Epistemology means that the ways of understanding. How do we understand something in the world? What are the sort of methods we use? How do we go about knowing things outside in the world? I mean, it's very easy, like if you're in medicine, if you're in physics, if you're in chemistry, it's really, there are very sort of agreed upon methods. If you're in mathematics, you know that how to add up or subtract. And in my former life, I was an engineer, and now I have no memory of that world, but my mind is very messy these days. You know, like I can't go back to the. But in history, in sociology, you know, it's always a debated issue. How do we know what's going on outside? I mean, all of us in this room have a sense of what's going on out there in the world. Right? You don't need a PhD to know that. You don't need to teach a class to know that. Everyone knows. But everybody has a sense, a way of knowing what's going on in the world. So, and when I say that there is an epistemological intervention here, it's that I'm sort of referring to that kind of non-binary understanding. What happens if we understand the world in non-binary ways? And things that are in a continuum. You know, a lot of conversations these days, this theory comes from gender studies mostly, on queer theory, that there's really against these binaries, that so people exist on a continuum. There is no good, bad, there is no sort of man, woman, there is a continuum in there. So if we apply that to understanding of history and society, what kind of picture do we get? The other part, which is more phenomenological, whenever you're getting tired, just tell me, I stop, and then we'll go out and have a drink. In California, it's very hard to give a lecture, that the weather is always nice, Where I come from, the temperature outside is minus 25 degrees, and, nobody wants to go out, you talk for 5 hours, they say, look, talk more, it's nice and warm, Who wants to go out, Phenomenological is like, you take things at the face value. You understand things the way they appear, rather than to say that, oh, it appears like this, but I know what's behind it. A lot of Marxist literature is very anti-phenomenological. We do have phenomenological Marxists, but a lot of Marxist literature is anti-phenomenological, because they say that, oh, okay, things appear this way, but I know what's going on deeper behind it, right? So, you put yourself in a very sort of privileged position to understand. You have this bird's eye view of the world, and then you say that, okay, you might think that there's a bunch of people sitting here listening to what you're saying, but actually no, they don't care at all, because these issues have no utility in the marketplace, for example, right? So they can't care, I said, no, I see their faces, they're really into it. So, no, you see the surface, the appearance. So what does that mean? If I, for example, if I say that the Iranian Revolution was a religious revolution, the anti-phenomenological people would say that, well, it appeared to be religious, but behind it, religion was masking something else, right? Religion is masking real grievances, and for that reason, it's wrong to say, for example, this was an Islamic revolution, because you are not going behind the appearances, right? Okay. So why? This was all introduction to say that why then this was very important to me to think about Foucault's writings on the Iranian Revolution. Just like 2 lines, Michel Foucault perhaps is one of the most important philosophers of 20th century in so many different fields, from history, from anthropology, to sociology, to philosophy, to gender studies, to studies of power, theories of power. You name it, Foucault is a key figure in all these different fields, for better or for worse. I mean, I'm not saying that, Foucault is the greatest thing ever happened since sliced bread. No, but he's that important. So, in 1978, when the revolution was happening in Iran, another very, very, very important conversation was happening in France in 1978. The conversation was about the end of age of revolutions. And I want you to think back about what I said earlier, right? So anything that happens outside Europe really didn't count, right? The greatest revolution in world history is happening. And people in France are debating that the age of revolutions are over. And this is a very interesting revisionist book by this philosopher, historian, François Furet, the interpretation of French Revolution. Said, really French Revolution was the only revolution in the world. And after that, there were like a number of imitations, and then the age of revolution is over. And here is Foucault, a French philosopher, and said, but wait a minute, something is really happening, major is happening right around the corner. And we're sitting here talking about the end of age of revolutions. So he already had this interest in Iranian affairs through his work. Foucault, as many of you might know, was gay and many and very much involved in gay politics and rights of prisoners, and through many Iranian activists, like in 1970s, it was basically impossible to be in a college in the US or anywhere in Europe and not be exposed to Iranian politics because of Iranian student activists. So Foucault was already exposed to this issue of political prisoners in Iran. Again, there was this myth that there were 150,000 political prisoners in Iran. This myth has a very interesting kind of history that when I was writing my first book, I tried to figure out, so where did this figure come from? 150,000 political prisoners. Because I remember, when the revolution happened, I was in Iran and we all went to Evin prison, and they had released the last year during the revolution 1,200 prisoners, and then Evin prison, there was nobody there. And then I remember going there and they said that, oh, they're all in the dungeons. The rest of the 140,000 prisoners are in the dungeons. So everybody's looking for the dungeons. So there were no dungeons, that was it, And of course now we know that at its height there were only 3,700 political prisoners in Iran. But then the numbers were so exaggerated, and the person who actually coined 150,000 was Reza Barahani, the Iranian poet, in an article in the New York Review of Books. And then Amnesty International took that and turned that into the official position of Amnesty International. And then everybody else, even Reza Barahani later, when he was referring to the political prisoner situation in Iran, referenced Amnesty International. It's a sort of a very interesting kind of loopy-loop of loopy-loop is a very technical term in academia. Anyhow, so Foucault was exposed already to this issue, and he wanted to do something called philosophical journalism. He wanted to write the history of the present. He was a historian, a philosopher and historian, and then he had a project to come to the US and write a series called Carter's America. And then while he was thinking about this, the revolution in Iran started. And he said, oh, well, why should I go to the US? I go to Iran, and it's sort of related to Carter's America. And so he went to Iran. Partly I wanted to have this slideshow because of this picture, because I think it's so out there amazing that Foucault is waiting for his luggage at Mehrabad airport in 1978. It's an interesting fact that if you're in my world, especially in California, because Foucault spent a lot of time in Berkeley towards the end of his life, and I went to graduate school at UC Santa Cruz, and at the time in late 1980s, 1990s, if you go to grad school, this was sort of rite of passage, you became a knight if you read all Foucault, and every little thing Foucault had written was translated into English. All his lectures and continue to be translated into English. A conversation he had with a graduate student in a coffee shop in Berkeley was published. Everything. And all these years, I had no idea that Foucault actually wrote about the Iranian Revolution. And the very first time I sort of discovered this was through this translation in Farsi. What the Iranians dreaming about, Iranian چه جوهری در سر دارن, one of the articles, essays he wrote. And then this is a later translation, Iran, the spirit of a spiritless world. Another title of an interview. Iran, the spirit of a spiritless world. So it was a curiosity to me that why is it that Foucault wrote all these things and everybody read them except these pieces about the Iranian Revolution. And then I started digging into it. Of course, when the people started writing about Foucault, they said that he was a gullible man. One of the reviews of my book actually mentioned this, that why bother to write about a gullible man? So they compared him to sort of Heidegger and Heidegger's tendencies towards Nazis. And they said, Foucault also had these tendencies towards Islamists, and was fooled by this kind of seemingly emancipatory politics. I was very lucky to get to know the person who turned Foucault to the Iranian situation, a French sociologist by the name of Paul Veillet. And when I went to University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, Paul Veillet was there, just my luck. And then he told me Foucault's reading list. He said that this is how he prepared himself to go to Iran. Reading list that was given to him by Paul Veillet. Among the important texts that he read were two important French orientalist Islamologists. One, Louis Massignon, who wrote this 4-volume called on Hallaj, a mystic martyr. If you don't have time to read the 4-volume, there's an abridged version of Hallaj. The movie is not made yet, so we can't watch the movie yet, but the abridged version would do it. And another person, Henri Corbin. It's interesting that both of these French Islamologists, expert on Shi'i Islam, they had a very particular understanding of Shi'ism. And Foucault was pretty much influenced by that particular understanding of Shi'ism. In their view, Shi'ism, and you can tell by Massignon's book on Hallaj. Those of you who know, Hallaj was a sort of mystic who basically was set on fire because he claimed that he is the truth, And these are very sort of pretty wild out there kind of mystics who claimed martyrdom, and both Massinian and Corban, less so Corban, but mostly Massinian, they believed that Shiism is a religion of saints and martyrs. And they constantly reproduce this kind of sainthood and martyrdom in their history. And of course, there are plenty of examples to support that. I mean, those of you who are even remotely familiar with Shiism, you would see that there is a really good historical foundation to understand Shiism along those terms. What was really absent in their work was the formal juridical and legal Shiism, which is something that we see that after the revolution is that side of Shiism that sort of basically becomes the central kind of characteristics of the Iranian Revolution, that formal, legal, juridical sort of Shiism that is primarily absent in these writings, and is primarily absent in Foucault's understanding of the Iranian Revolution. Of course, if you understand Shiism along those lines, then you go to Iran and see millions of people marching on the streets without fear, without any kind of consideration of or consequences of the fact that you go to the streets and stand in front of soldiers with machine guns. And Foucault says that, damn right, you know, this is the religion of martyrdom and sainthood. Of course, you know, at the time that Foucault goes to Iran, there is a very interesting kind of formation. This is where I want to go back to that understanding of non-binary understandings, because a lot of people talk about, you know, the revolution was between secular and religious forces. I have spent the last 20 years or so combing through the literature of political parties to Iran to find which political party was speaking the language of secularism in Iran. No one. I mean, not that secularism did not exist, but the language of secularism was not spoken. The only people who talked about secularism, people who were against the revolution. Among the forces of revolution, among the people who participated in revolution, the language of secularism was not spoken. And there was a very good reason for that, that language was not spoken. I'm sure many of you remember this, because this was also a very important moment in Iranian political history, the public trial of Khosrow Gul Surkhi, a Marxist journalist, essayist, poet. And if I'm going to read this little passage from his defense, that it would shock the audiences today, but at the time it was totally fine. Nobody was scandalized by these lines that I'm going to read you, which today seem very, very unlikely. You know. So in his defense, he says, he reads this, one of his poems, and then he says this: I begin my defense with the words of Imam Hussein. This is a Marxist. Yeah. I begin my defense with the words of Imam Hussein, the greatest martyr of the peoples of the Middle East. As a Marxist-Leninist, I searched for social justice for the first time in the teachings of Islam. And then I found socialism. In Iran, the true Islam has always fulfilled its duty to the liberation movements. There are close similarities between what Marx says, that in a class society, wealth is accumulated in one side and poverty, hunger, and misery on the other, and that the downtrodden is the producer of wealth, and what Imam Ali says, that no palace is built without the misery of thousands. That is why I call Imam Ali the first socialist in world history. Being tried today in this courtroom is just another example of Imam Hussein's life. Hussein stood up and was martyred by Yazid. Yazid occupied a smaller corner in history, but what has been repeated in history is the legacy of Hussein and his struggle, not the rule of Yazid. People's history is the reenactment of Hussein's path. As a Marxist, I applaud such an Islam, the Islam of Ali, the Islam of Hussein. So when I say that, when I mean, in the olden days, the monarchy in Iran constantly was the propaganda was that these were works of Islamist Marxists, and everybody sort of laughed at that kind of assertion. But there was two different things happening at the same time. There were Islamist Marxists and there were Marxist Islamists, in the sense that Iranian Marxists, in their ethos, in their understanding of history, in the way they related to one another, in the way they understood how history unfolded, were very, very much influenced by the same kind of Shiism that Foucault was influenced by, and the same kind of Shiism that guided and framed their political ideology. So Iranian Marxists were, in a sense, quite Shiite in their cultural ethos and the way they understood their own place in the world. Of course, this was not only the Marxists who had this kind of affinity towards Shiism, particularly Shiism, not Islam in general, but also the Muslims. Perhaps the most obvious example would be Ali Shariati, who actually borrowed heavily from a lexicon of Marxist understanding of history, questions of class society, questions of imperialism, questions of justice. He borrowed from Lenin, very openly borrowed from Lenin, the idea of vanguard parties. He borrowed from Sukarno, the Indonesian leader. He borrowed from Trotsky. He constantly talked about permanent revolution. And he also borrowed from Shia Islam. He was a committed, practicing Muslim. And he translated Frantz Fanon. This is actually, when I was looking in the archives, I saw this very interesting letter that his Sawa Candler agent was following him, wrote this report to his superior saying that, we noticed that Ali Shariati is busy translating Frantz Fanon to Farsi. So, between Fanon, Sartre, Marxism, Marxist existentialism, and Islam, you see that this kind of, way of continuum, rather than binary understanding of how this political force in Iran was shaping in the context of a very, very culturally specific moment. It generated a very kind of idiosyncratic language of speaking about justice and speaking about revolution. I just want to read a passage from Shariati to see that when I read the Marxist view, and then this is Shariati, that there's that there was a campaign against Shariati in the seminaries, and one of the leaders of this campaign against Shariati was Ayatollah Milani, one of the sources of emulation in Qom, who actually banned his students from attending Shariati's sermons, lectures. And so Shariati writes this really fascinating letter to Ayatollah Milani, one of the highest ranking. At the time, Ayatollah Milani was much more significant religiously from Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini was pretty marginal in terms of religious credentials, actually. So after saying, hello, Ayatollah Milani, I love you, you're the greatest thing ever happened, blah, blah. And then he says this. Everybody is asking this question, Shariati says. Why is that pious people such as yourself, who sit on the cathedral of the deputy of the Shia Messiah, Imam Zaman, as a source of emulation, have not uttered a word about tyranny in this world? For 8 years, the French army bloodied and massacred Muslims of Algeria, ruined their cities, tortured their warriors, and Algerians fought heroically. The enlightened Christian priests in France sympathized with the Algerians. The existentialist Sartre and the anti-religion Mrs. Simone de Beauvoir defended them and endangered their own lives for the sake of the Algerians' cause. Even the French communist Henri Alleg joined the Algerian resistance and made the atrocities of the French, their torture of the Algerians Mujahideens, known to the world. You, one of the leaders of the Shia world, did not even issue a meaningless statement of sympathy. It perturbs me deeply to witness that while that is happening, a great source of emulation writes on the pages of his book that the Prophet has advised those who eat melon would go to the heaven. He said that, اونهایی که هندونه میخورن میرن به بهشت. And then you have the audacity to call me an unfit element. And then he goes on and says that, my teacher at Sorbonne, George Gurvich, a Jewish communist, is a better source of emulation than you, Ayatollah Milani, who is sitting in Qom. So in that sense, you see this kind of, when I go back to that binary, said that if you have those binaries, how do you explain these things? If you move through those binaries, then you're going to pigeonhole Shariati in the Islamist part. You pigeonhole people like Golestorchi in the other side, and then then you try to write a narrative that actually speaks to those pigeonholes rather than what actually happens in reality. So Foucault was very much aware of this scene. He knew Shariati. He talked to people around Shariati. He talked to Ehsan Naraghi. And then Ehsan Naraghi also, quite an interesting character there. Dr. Milani knows that. Also, when Foucault arrives in Iran, it's only a few days after the declaration of martial law in Tehran, 17 Shahrivar in September 1978. And then in his early writings, he said that I entered a city that I expected to be totally colonized by terror. Of course, the reason he says that is these pictures that this is before and after, right? This is the declaration of martial law, and this is when people, of course, didn't know martial law was declared. That day, this is the best day ever that I overslept. You're supposed to be there. So, of course, when he writes this thing, again, you see I'm trying to bring all these elements together here to say that when he's thinking about something very special is happening here, that there is a transformation that is happening in the streets of Tehran. And by the way, the second time he goes to Iran twice, second time he goes to Iran, this is in front of Tehran University. Some of you might remember, this is 13 Aban. Another massacre happens. It's just his luck that whenever he's going to Iran, the massacre happens and he shows up. And he says that, in his early writings on the Iranian Revolution, he said that in France, we always talked about this abstract political concept called collective will of a people, that this is how history moves. And he said that, in France, we never knew what the hell this collective will is. Nobody has ever seen a collective will. And he says that, collective will sounded like God, that God is there, something. And he said that, and he writes to his, this essay, he said that, but for the first time, I think for the first time in history, I saw the collective will of a people on the streets of Tehran. Something really transformative is happening there to him, and he thinks that this transformation is also happening on the streets of Tehran. And I like this picture because this sort of captures, Walter Benjamin defines revolution as a leap into the sky of historical possibilities, as a leap to the sky of historical possibilities. I like this picture because there's a leap there, and you never know where you land. Revolutions are dangerous business, you know, and you never know where you land. And here Foucault says that, you know, and everybody says that these Iranians are really crazy. There are all these very, very interesting sort of journalistic reports of mostly French journalists who are in Tehran. And one of them, Claire Berrier, who made a lot of sort of interesting contacts for Foucault and many others. And she writes this thing that, you know, these Iranians are swimming in ambiguity. It's not quite clear. Everybody knows that the Shah has to go. No one knows what happens next. You know, it's totally ambiguous. And of course, this ambiguity adds also to the mystery. I mean, you would imagine that people possibly might willing to sacrifice their lives because they say that, okay, I'm going to do this because I'm going to gain that, you know. And what that gained, that was absent in this Iran. There's a sort of a general understanding of the notion of justice, the notion of freedom. But what exactly entailed in that, nobody knew. It's totally ambiguous. And everybody started running away from. In France, people already started writing about the counter-revolution in Iran. Even up to today, when people, the French sociologists, like Alain Turan, the great sociologist, they refer to Iranian revolution as the counter-revolution. Because again, I go back to that original point, that it wasn't sort of unfolding on the lines that everybody expected revolutions to fall. So Foucault says, well, but wait a minute. Let's set aside all these assumptions that we have about a teleological history. How do we see this revolution if our assumption is not that this revolution was supposed to realize an already determined future? What happens if we don't understand the present time? This is a little bit complicated, just bear with me. If you don't understand the present time as futures past, if you don't understand the present time as futures past, because if we know where we are going in history, present time only makes sense if it's going towards that particular future. Right? So if you don't understand present time as futures past, how do we write about it? How do we know what's good, what's bad? What is that yardstick that we say that, okay, these political forces are good, progressive? Because once you say progressive, then you have an assumption. Progressive towards what? Right? There isn't already an end point in your mind when you evaluate or use the yardstick for political parties. So Foucault says that, you know, let's pause for a minute and give conceptual significance to this ambiguity. Let's think of this ambiguity in the Iranian Revolution as the condition of possibilities. Maybe it's not all that bad that things are not quite clear. Maybe ambiguity has generated a space, a historical space, in which people can participate to figure out alternative futures, futures that nobody has ever thought about. You know, these days we have this kind of neo-anarchist position that another world is possible. But it's exactly the same thing. Is another world possible or not really? We're just kidding ourselves. You know? So Foucault says that this is a moment of ambiguity, and if you give it a conceptual significance, then we can understand that there might be possibilities of constituting new forms of social relations, social world, history, so on and so forth. I have 5 more minutes and I'm going to stop. The other thing that Foucault emphasizes is that there is also something really interesting happening in Iran, and then he calls that a political spirituality. Of course, a lot of people misunderstood Foucault's notion of political spirituality because people thought that he's talking about religious character of a revolution. He was not really talking about the religious character of revolution in relation to political spirituality. He said that he has this amazing line that if he never wrote another line, I would be very, very happily say he was one of the greatest thinkers of 20th century. He said that a man in revolt is ultimately inexplicable. Excuse the gender language there. A man in revolt is ultimately inexplicable. No one can really explain what happens that suddenly somebody is transformed from inside to reach a point that that transcends, he says, that transcends fear. I mean, we all human beings and we understand fear. But without transcending fear, these revolutions cannot happen. You have to transcend fear. And then he said that the beauty of it is that this transcendence happens without the subjects who are doing the transcendence being aware of it. They go through this process and they become someone they never expected to have the ability to become. I'm sure all of us have these moments in our lives that we are in the moment that we do something that is above and beyond our own abilities. That later on, in retrospect, you say that, wow, how could I do that? And so he said that this is an important point for Foucault to understand this, and he moves away from earlier sort of explanations of revolutions, which was based on, economic situation, political situation. He said, no, there is something that is sort of part of transformation of the individual. And this spirituality for Foucault was not a sort of matter of the soul. It was the matter of the body. It's sort of, very counterintuitive in the sense. He said that people can, when I say that it's a spiritual act, it means that you are releasing your body from the prison house of your soul. You are sort of stripping off all these techniques of docility. We are all, concerned all the time that what is the proper behavior in society? How do we behave to be acceptable? How do we behave in the classroom? How do we behave in this lecture hall? How do we behave at work? How do we behave when we're driving? All these things that our body is so much under control of our soul that are sort of act upon this kind of techniques that we learn in our lives. He calls that the techniques of docility. We become docile subject. And he says that, this political spirituality is a very corporeal thing. It's bodily. You release your body suddenly that you have no fear of anything, Anyhow. And last but not least is his notion that because, a lot of people say that, but how could you defend this revolution? Because we all know what happened after the revolution. And he says that, well, again, another kind of misunderstanding of Foucault's writings on the Iranian Revolution, that he says that there should be a distinction, a decoupling of the revolt from the outcome of revolution. He says, is it useless to revolt? Is it useless if people know that they can't change anything? Is it useless to attempt change? He called himself a very hyper-pessimist activist. Hyper-pessimist activist. At the end of the day, we all might think that, we can't change this world. And is it then okay to think of those people who try to change it as naive, as stupid, as worthless? He said, no. Actually, I read this poem by Shamlu, and I end here. that, and I think it captures what Foucault was trying to say, that once you enter this world of revolt, once you transcend your body from all those techniques of docility, you become a new subject. You become a different person. You are not the same person you were before that, despite the fact that you might fail, despite the fact that there is going to be situation worse than before. But you, the subject of history, has been transformed. And let me read this poem of Shamlou, because I use this in my book too, that he says, در یکی فریاد زیستن پرواز اسیانی فواره‌ای که خلاصیش از خاک نیست. پرواز اسیانی فواره‌ای که خلاصیش از خاک نیست و رهایی را تجربه می‌کند. The rebellious flight of a fountain that cannot escape the earth and is simply trying deliverance. Thank you. I went over 4 minutes, so yeah. And I'm drenching in sweat because I get very excited. So I'm going to take some questions. Yes.
So have you read Shiism and Martyrdom by Shariati?
Yes.
Yeah, so one question I have, at the end of his essay, he says that, like, it seems like he's saying in that essay that the Iranian, like, the kind of fiery spirit, kind of that that Quzurbash had, that Shah Ismail had, kind of died at the Battle of Chaldiran.
That's right.
So that fiery spirit that kind of revolutionized Islam in the 1500s.
That's right.
Could you argue that, that it's hard to put a label, that kind of revolutionary spirit found in Zoroastrian movements from Mazdak to Abu Muslim and all these guys, like, if that loss of confidence happened after the battle of Chaldiran, could the Iranian Revolution be a restoration of that confidence within Iranian identity that was kind of lost after?
Yeah. It's a hard question. I mean, I'm not quite sure how do we count for something like Iranian identity. It's a very fluid kind of thing. I don't want to suggest that there is something called Iranian identity that moves in centuries of history. Obviously, people are alive and add new experiences, and they understand the world very, very differently in each historical epoch. But the way Shariati conceptualizes that is that he makes a distinction between Islam of movement and Islam of institution. And he said that whenever Islam is institutionalized, it loses its revolutionary core. So for example, for Shariati, it would be very, very easy to argue against the Islamic Republic today. Because he says that once you institutionalize Islam, then you lose that revolutionary spirit and that revolutionary core. That's why in his writing, he always talks about permanent revolution. Because once you stop, once you pause, then you are bureaucratized. Then you develop interests of agents of that bureaucracy. Of course, he learns this from Trotsky too, and what happened in the Russian Revolution. So in that sense, I think that's the way he understands it. And then he comes up with this kind of Safavid Shiism and Alawid Shiism that again, Safavid Shiism. In a sense, one can argue that today we have Safavid Shiism in Iran, because once the religion becomes the sort of the official religion of the state, then it loses its dynamic core. And that happened during, for the first time actually, during the Safavid period, that Shiism becomes that sort of state religion, and then the movement that continues to be a part of Shiism becomes very, very marginalized, according to Shariati's historiography, and then he wants to revive that kind of revolutionary spirit.
Thank you so much for the good points and good thoughts. You mentioned about, people call it Islamic Revolution, some people say non-Islamic Revolution. You refuted that partly because the number of people who participated, if it wasn't because of the clergy, that many people would not have to do something like that. So that, you characterize that as a reason to call it Islamic Revolution.
One of the reasons, yeah.
One of the reasons.
Yeah.
So, on that line, I wanted to see what you think about the major reasons in order of importance that this thing happened. And was the motivation for having an Islamic society was the main motivation for this whole movement? I doubt that was it, but that's an, I don't want
Yeah,
to have it.
yeah.
But, you know, I just wanted to
Yeah. No, I mean, that's, you know, that's one of the reasons. Of course, it's sort of revolutions involve mobilization and all these things, you know, networks and all. Of course, revolution also had a rhythm, you know, like a rhythm that actually the Shah, in his famous speech in the summer of 1978, very rightfully actually addresses this issue. And he says that, you know, they have politicized the third day of death, you know, Sevom, Haftom, Chelom, the 40th day of death, and turned that into a political event, you know, which was true, of course, you know. And I think the Shah was totally right, because that was really a very important constitutive element of how the revolutionary movement was perpetuated. Because the key always, if you study all these different revolutions, the key always in all these revolutions, the sort of $64,000 question, I mean, for California, $64,000 is nothing. You know. In Urbana-Champaign, $64,000 is a lot of money. The $64,000 question for all revolutionary movements is how to perpetuate a movement. That's the very, very key question. And if you see all these failed movements that were not able to create that perpetuation in Iran, that perpetuation happens by sort of appropriating this kind of what I call the religious rhythm. There's this religious rhythm that is politicized, and people can identify with it and and participate in it. There's a very important concept Hegel talks about. He says that concept is Sittlichkeit. Sittlichkeit means that this sort of ethical order, unspoken ethical order, that nobody says that, okay, I do X, Y, Z, but everybody practices the same thing, right? And Shiism was, in a sense, the Sittlichkeit of the Iranian Revolution, that people could identify with these sort of nodules, these points, and participate in this revolutionary movement. The other part that I say that this was an Islamic revolution was exactly because of this sort of non-binary understanding. I mean, when I say that this was an Islamic revolution, that Islam is very, very, very different from the Islam that becomes the ideology of the post-revolutionary state. They're totally different kinds of things. And indeed, when people say that we want baradari hukumat adl Ali, brotherhood and equality and the governance of Ali, the rule of Ali, Imam Ali. What did that mean to people? It meant a lot of different things. To Khosrow Golestorkhi meant something very different because he's talking about it. To the mullahs in Qom, it meant something. To masses and masses of people on the streets, it meant something. But also, it became something that could unify the people, and to a very kind of irreducible thing. The massive, massive numbers, as I say, that became the hallmark of the Iranian Revolution was exactly through these kind of connections of cultural, ideological, political and political actors who were bringing all these things together in that sense.
Study the French philosophers Foucault and your book.
Yeah.
If he was alive today and he took a flight to Tehran
Mm-hmm.
and Khomeini Airport,
Yeah.
what would you think he would say about what's happening there?
First, he would say, "This airport sucks." You know. No, the people asked him, that how come it didn't problematize you when you were people saying that hukumat Islami, the Islamic rule, Islamic government. And Foucault said, to me, I don't need the adjective Islamic. When people say government, I am already scandalized, So it doesn't matter, what kind of government. All governments, for Foucault, it was politically, he's closest to an anarchist understanding of political philosophy. He was an anti-government person. So for that very reason, if he goes to Iran today, he said that this is another government like all other governments in the world. It's oppressive. It implements techniques of docility. It implements the formation of what in my work I call Homo Islamicus, a new man. All revolutions try to create a new man. Frantz Fanon talks about, revolution that creates new man. Marx talks about the new man. Everyone wants to create. Revolutions were understood at the ground zero of history. You do that, you build everything. At that moment, at that ground zero, Foucault goes all the way to ground zero, but he wants to disconnect from the kind of building they're building, because he believes that there are always, in any form, if it's liberal governments, it's socialist governments, Islamic governments, any kind of governments, they create structures that would operate in oppressive relations with human subjects in society. So he would basically, if he were alive today, actually I just met his partner a couple of months ago, and he asked me if I could arrange for him to go to Iran. I said I can arrange for myself to go to Iran, but no, he wouldn't care. He wouldn't. Okay, going to Iran, he would think that this is another oppressive government like all other governments in the world. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any speculation about what will happen when Khamenei dies?
There are a lot of speculations, but but I don't know. There are so many different scenarios that I don't think I can talk about them. I have no idea what's going to happen after Khamenei dies. I think I'm much safer to say that. Yes.
Your way of explaining this process of revolution, how do you explain the hostage crisis in sequence or the process?
Yeah. Good. In my first book, I tried to show, this is Islam and Dissent in Post-Revolutionary Iran. I wanted to show that there is a fierce competition among revolutionary forces to show which one is more radical, which one is more anti-imperialist, which one is willing to push the revolution forward in really uncharted territories. Of course, for the left, the Iranian left, of which I was a part, the view was that the provisional government that came to power right after the revolution, Mehdi Bazargan government, it was the sort of the equivalent of the Kerensky government in Russian Revolution. Iranian left was very formalist. The Iranian left constantly tried to sort of find the answer to all the questions in the Iranian Revolution via, writings of Lenin, or it's just an interesting phenomenon in itself. But that was the understanding that the February Revolution in Iran was the February Revolution in Russia. And the understanding was that we have to push forward and radicalize this to such a degree that the October Revolution would come after this. Of course, one of the means of radicalizing the revolution was by making it more and more anti-imperialist. Now, there is a lot of documents that just came out last year, and the BBC published them on their website, about the negotiations that had happened between Khomeini and his people with the US government in terms of how they promised to keep the main institutions of pre-revolutionary power, like military, intact. And of course, the left knew that. The left knew that, and they wanted to push and to say that, see, they are betraying the revolution. They want to slow down the revolution. And one attempt was made right after the revolution to occupy the American embassy, and Khomeini ordered them to be kicked out. And because that attempt happened by the Iranian Fadayan group, the guerrilla group, and then later, this was all sort of, again, this is sort of in the context of two things: competition to radicalize the revolution, to make it a permanent revolution. In the debates in drafting the Iranian constitution, which is a fascinating theater. I mean, if you haven't read it, this is the document. There's 4,000 pages of minutes of this available, actually, through the Library of National Archives in Iran. And constantly the debate is that how do we make sure that the revolution doesn't stop here? They're all Shariatists in their mind. They fear that this revolution is going to be institutionalized, and they want to find a solution how to make it a permanent revolution. And when the issue of Velayat Faqih comes into the debate, it's only in that context that, okay, there's one person who can make sure that the revolution is continuous, is permanent, and that's Khomeini himself, you know that. But then, of course, you know, the fear was that if the Islamist faction doesn't attempt to radicalize the revolution, it would be the left who would radicalize the revolution and gain more legitimacy in the eyes of revolutionary masses. So that's one reason. The other reason was really, truly, I mean, I knew half of these students who took over American Embassy. They were from my campus. I knew at least half of them. The entire leadership position of that I knew personally. And their understanding was that they wanted to interrupt any American attempt to launch a coup after the revolution. That was their understanding. They wanted to go in there and get out after a couple of days, and to show Americans that, okay, we know what you're up to, you know. And of course, they go in there, things get totally out of hand. They see all these shredding documents, they see all these things, and then immediately, you know, the Revolutionary Council takes over, and then it turns into the hostage crisis, which was totally unintended consequence of the embassy attack. So two things: interruption in possible American coup, counter-revolution, and competition for radicalization of revolution.
You know, we had the first draft of the Constitution that was going to go to vote on December 10th, and after November 4th, when the embassy was taken over,
Right.
then somehow the second draft shows up,
That's right.
which has the Islamic government in
That's
it.
right.
The first one didn't have it, so there is a
The
little
first
bit
draft
of
is, yeah.
footwork there.
That's a whole different, if Dr. Milani invites me again after this, I would be more than, I'll be more than happy just to focus on what happens to these drafts of Constitution. How did they write these drafts of Constitution? Because there are a bunch of people who have no clue about writing a Constitution. And indeed, they were supposed to approve the first draft in 10 days, and this took more than 4.5 months. They sat there, they kept talking about it, and there is this session which is so hilarious. That's why I say it's a true theater. Where is Mr. Beizai? He needs to write a play about that, because that's the only person who can do this. Because there is this Ayatollah who's sitting there, he said that, I'm not quite sure what are we supposed to do, you know, like Islamic constitution, why should we write a constitution? We have the Sharia, we have this, what else do we need to do, you know? And Ayatollah Beheshti tells him, he shouts, you know, he says that, that's because you don't do your homework. We gave you the constitution of China and the constitution of Bulgaria to read, and we told you, wherever you see Marxism, change it to Islam. That's, I kid you not. I mean, it's in the minutes. You know? So, I mean, all these, of course, this is an interesting thing. I mean, it's like when people say that, oh, this is like Islamic, the Quran, and this is, what Quran, you know? This is about the Constitution of China. And the first draft was the Constitution of Belgium, and then French Constitution, and then French-Belgian Constitution turned into Chinese-Bulgarian Constitution. Again, you know, to my original point, that don't understand things in binary terms, you know, because then you see a lot of things happening in the middle that really becomes, the world out there becomes a little bit counterintuitive in that sense. So shall I stop here?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.